Hello and welcome to Walk the Talk Show with Waylon Lewis, coming to you live from Boulder, Colorado. And I'm here with my longtime friend and crusader, Robyn O'Brien. I guess you're not my crusader, you're our crusader. And we're here to talk about food allergies and children's health, GMOs, all kinds of issues that are relevant to our daily lives. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So we begin these with a little, this being Boulder, we have to start with a little Buddhist bow. So as a viewer, if you'd like to join, you can take a good posture. This is great for entrepreneurs or anyone who wants to start business meetings in a fun little way. Basically, you connect with heaven, earth, and your heart in between. So you take a good posture and connect with the earth. That's the realm of details, getting things done, emails, whatever. And then you connect your head with the heavens. That's the realm of vision or mission, what you really care about in your life. Then you can find your breath and connect with your heart, which joins the two in the realm of society. And Robyn will be talking about how to be a benefit to society. And then you just give it away. So thanks so much for joining us and putting up with my weird Buddhist bow.
Oh, thank you, Waylon.
Yeah.
I've never done that before.
Yeah.
So.
It's fun. If you're over at Naropa much, they'll force you to do bows constantly. It's like
well,
Japan
you know, I mean, my background is totally different. I come
Yeah.
from a really conservative family in the South, and
Yeah.
my grandfather was the head of a church, so that's the first time I've ever done anything
Well,
like
nothing's
that.
more
But
conservative than respect, you know?
I agree,
So
that's
respect.
true.
And would you mind leading us, speaking of tradition, in a little prayer or aspiration maybe related to your mission?
Yeah, you know, I think when you really stop and think about what the children represent, the children of the world, they represent our future. So I would like to offer a prayer for the safety of children everywhere, not only here in the United States, but children around the world, to protect them and keep them safe as they become the next generation that leads our country and the world to hopefully a greater peace.
It's very apt right about now. We're seeing wars all over the world, and wars tend to affect, you know, the old cliche of like old men send children to war, and, you know, the public suffers.
Well, I think too, I mean, it's such a part of our history. I mean, it's personally a part of my history. My parents actually met in Vietnam. My dad
Wow.
was in the U.S. Army, and my mother was a nurse with Save the Children.
Wow.
And there's
Sounds
a lot,
like Hemingway or something.
I mean, it's a pretty incredible love story. They're still together. But all of the conflict that it represented. And so growing up, Mom always had these books from their time in Vietnam and from the children that she cared for that had been injured or hurt. And that was, you know, I think I probably have a lot of my mother's heart in me. And her crusade to save the children obviously is one that I have embraced. But in the work that I do today, you know, what started really with children's work and seeing what was happening with the health of this generation of kids and how they've earned this title of Generation RX. You know, I realized it was happening to the big kids too.
RX, like health.
Yeah, like prescriptions.
Oh,
know?
I see.
So it wasn't just the little kids, you know, they were big kids. And I can remember one day being approached by an 84-year-old grandmother who said, you know, I know you do this food allergy work, and I just suddenly developed an allergy to corn. And I started to get that kind of response over and over and over. So, you know, it was suddenly realizing that this whole landscape of health has changed for all of us.
So for those who don't know your work, haven't seen you in TED Talks or whatever, give us some, what are you talking about in terms of allergies have changed or
Yeah, well,
GMOs?
you know, I mean, I think probably I got to go back just a little bit. I grew up in the South in Texas.
Yeah.
I went to business school on a full scholarship, and I graduated as the top woman in my class. I was recruited by Exxon and Enron, you know, and I tend
Every hippie liberal's favorite companies.
I know,
Yeah.
but I tend to get bored pretty easily, and so I went to work as an analyst on a team that managed billions in assets. And I was the only woman on the team, and the guys had me cover the food industry. And, you know, we were covering tech, and we were covering...
They had you cover food because that's the most womanly thing or something?
Yeah, and, you know, I kind of told him, I said, I can't cook.
Yeah.
I burn noodles. This is not a good idea. But they didn't really care, and they said, you're the new guy on the totem pole, you're low guy, you're covering the food industry. So with that, I had threw myself into it, and I thought, okay, fine, I'm going to learn this business model. And that's really how I looked at it, just as the business model. And so we met with management teams, everybody from Kroger and Safeway to Whole Foods at the time, and Wild Oats when they were still an individual entity, and their ticker symbol was Oats. And all
Wild
these,
Oats was like a pre-Whole Foods.
Yeah, it was a public company on its own. And those management teams would come through the office, and they would, highlight their business models, and that was kind of it. And especially with the Whole Foods of the world, I just thought, this is a nice little marketing niche they've carved out. They've got some good margins here.
Right.
Makes sense. It's a pretty small segment of grocery category. I just kind of put them over here. And
were you eating Whole Foodsy kind of food at the time?
Oh, gosh, not at all.
Yeah.
I was a complete Diet Coke addict. Totally addicted.
What does that mean? You drank how many?
Oh, gosh, probably 4 or 5 a day. I mean, it was horrible, but I just had no idea. And I was just of that mindset that if somebody had put it on grocery store shelves, it was safe. Right. And I thought, the research had been done and the homework had been done, and surely nobody would put it on the shelves.
Right.
If it hadn't been proven safe. I was in a culture where that was the norm.
And we still think that. I mean, not to skip ahead out of the story, but you point out that the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, doesn't test GMOs or anything.
Well, again, here I was studying these business models for the food industry, how they drove profitability, how they took real ingredients out and swapped them in with these fake things. And it made a ton of sense, because if you put an artificial dye in, your cost of production is managed in a smarter way, because, it's cheaper to use an artificial dye than it is to use something that's natural. And so, it was easy to see why they took out the real stuff and swapped in the artificial stuff, because it helped their margins.
Right.
And as somebody who was sitting on the desk as an investor, I thought, that's awesome. That's great. That's earning better returns for our funds. That's great. I never asked any other questions. And so, it really wasn't until...
And you were healthy and...
Thankfully, yeah.
Yeah.
As far as I knew, I was healthy.
Right.
And I think, I was kind of typical American, where you just sort of... You have a stomach problem, you take a pill. You have a headache, you take a pill. You got acne, you take a pill. There was just probably a handful of things I was taking by the time I was 25 years old.
Wow.
And I just thought it was the norm, because we were sort of in a culture, and you were surrounded by people that's just what you did. If you had some kind of ailment, you took a pill.
You mean they're not doing homeopathy and yoga down in Texas?
We weren't doing it in Houston. No, we weren't. And maybe they are now, but this was, and they weren't. No.
Right.
Anyway, so all of a sudden, when we had decided we were moving to Colorado,
and was that for a business reason, or?
Well, my husband's from Seattle, and we wanted to be somewhere where neither of us were from. We wanted to have our own place and our own story. And
because you were from Texas.
I was from Texas, and both of us were from families that were really entrenched in each city.
Right. So he was like in your turf.
Yeah, and so we both felt that it would be really fun to go somewhere where neither of us were from. And I had a cousin who was like, Rob, you should look in Colorado. And, having traveled as a kid to come up skiing, all I had ever seen of Denver was just driving across I-70 to get to the mountains. It wasn't nice. And he said, go back. So we came back and visited, and my husband got a job offer out here. And, both of us had traveled a ton growing up and kind of had this adventuresome side to both of us. And we kind of said, let's do this. If it's great, we'll stay, and if it's not, we can just keep going and find another place. But this seems like a great opportunity. And so when our oldest was 6 weeks old, we moved out here. We didn't know anybody, and just kind of threw ourselves into Boulder. And
how do you wind up in Boulder? I mean, it would make more sense if you wound up in Westminster or Broomfield, or I Boulder's think such a weird little college town.
We came out to visit, and it's a captivating town. Yeah. And it was small, and so since we didn't know anybody, and all of a sudden I was going to be staying home with this little baby, I thought, this feels accessible. Big city would have felt just too big. So, and it was beautiful. It's just beautiful. It's so different to anything I'd ever known in Houston, and it was one of those things where I truly came into it as an adventure. That if this works, great. And that was 15 years ago. So, in those early years, it was really when we had our family, and we had these 4 babies. And, again, I really wasn't stopping to think about anything. It was a huge culture shift to go from Houston to Boulder. Those are two really totally different towns. And so I was kind of processing through a lot of that. Thankfully, I grew up playing a ton of sports, so the whole kind of athletic culture of Boulder, I just loved. I fell in love with that.
Yeah.
And all of the hiking and biking and outdoor and running and on trails, and just fell in love. But, when people were suggesting that I had to put cloth napkins in the kids' lunch boxes in preschool, and I had to send in real utensils and not plastic ones, and they weren't allowed to have tubes of yogurt in their lunch boxes, I felt like they were sort of infringing on me as a mom, and I thought, what? I don't get this. And I really didn't get it.
Was that the public schools saying that?
It was just some of the preschools the kids were in, and I look back on that time now, and I think about how educated, schooled I was, with this degree that I'd gotten in college. And again, I was really academic, and I had really focused on that all the way through my education, everything that I had done in business school. And so I had just been educated to this incredible degree, and yet at the same time I was totally illiterate on what was going into the food, how the stuff might impact the environment. Like, I'd never been schooled on that, and I don't know if it was a regional thing, I don't know if it's a generational thing, I don't know if it's cultural or media, but in the beginning, when I realized how illiterate I was, I sort of had this moment of did I just miss this? Do other people know all of this stuff about all this junk that's going into the food and the way that it can harm us, or the way that it can impact so many different parts of our society? And so I was a little bit embarrassed at first, and then I thought, as I started to ask people about GMOs or some of these other things in the food, some of them, this was back in 2006, they looked at me like I had three heads. They were just like, there's no way it's that bad. They wouldn't put it on the shelves if it were that bad. And, again, it was, how as a country have we not had this conversation? How, when a lot of these ingredients were introduced into our food supply, did we not have this dialogue? And how had I, as an analyst that covered the food industry, never had those meetings with these companies? And that, to me, too, was really fascinating, because we'd covered the food industry. And GMOs, I was suddenly learning, were in everything that we were eating. Most processed foods.
The staples, yeah. Yeah,
most processed foods. Anyone that was just shopping in a pretty conventional grocery store was going to be ingesting a lot of this stuff.
Or even not.
Right. And
anywhere.
All of a sudden I'm thinking, if this is in all of our food, why, as a food industry analyst, did we never meet with these companies that were making the GMOs? And so I started to kind of dig into that. And it had happened because, here I'd come out of this conservative financial background, had these 4 kids, and then suddenly their health started to really downward spiral. Not just the baby who had the allergic reaction, but one of my boys got really sick. And as I was looking at what was happening with them, and especially the food allergy one, all of a sudden I was having to read labels to figure out what ingredients were in these foods, if it was safe for that baby. And that was, it was just this shield, really, that I had to wear to protect her. And as I started reading these labels, it was one of those moments where I'm like, what is this stuff? And why did I never ask these questions when I was an analyst? And, we knew that these things were smart to go into the product because it helped drive margins and profitability. But I had never asked, what are these things doing in combination? And how might this impact the developing immune system of a child or of a man that has colon cancer? And all of a sudden I had a whole new set of questions that I hadn't thought of as an analyst. Right. And so as I started looking at, a lot of these ingredients, the research part of me, the part that had been business school and the financial analyst, I snapped it onto this. And I started doing a ton of research and capturing headlines. And every morning I'd be screening through studies and science and all this different stuff. And one morning this headline came across about a grant that the EPA had given to a small university in Michigan. And this was in the fall of 2006. And the title of the article was basically something like, do genetically engineered foods cause food allergies? And I'm looking at this thing, and I was like, what's a genetically engineered food? I mean, we didn't cover it when I was an analyst, and we didn't cover this in school. So what is this? And as I started digging into what is a genetically engineered food, and this was back in 2006, really before there had been a big conversation, it was stunning, and I kept coming back to this big company, Monsanto. And so because I came out of this finance background, I punched in their ticker symbol, and at the time outflew this $35 billion company. And I'm like, this is a chemical company, you know, and it was when you're learning about something for the first time and it's all coming at you so hard and fast, you're thinking like, okay, this isn't our food, but this is a chemical company, and how is this all fitting together? And I looked across the table at my husband that night and I said, have you ever heard of this chemical company Monsanto? And he said, no. And I said, they've got something in pretty much everything in our kitchen, because I was a Houston family, you know, so I wasn't buying all organic or anything, even though we were living in Boulder. Like, I was still kind of in that habit of the things that I had grown up on. And so you learned at that point what genetic engineering is. So what, you know, so again, so I reached out to the researcher. Yeah. And I said, you know, I'm learning about these genetically engineered foods. What are they? And he said, you know, there's this new technology where you're able to insert these new ingredients into the seed of a plant. And it introduces a certain new trait or a new characteristic into that plant. And in some cases, it enables that plant to just be routinely soaked with a weed killer like Roundup. And in other cases... Roundup is Monsanto's weed killer. Weed killer, right. You know, and then in other cases, it enables that plant to create its own insecticide internally within the plant, so that as it grows, it releases its own insecticide. So, you know, I'm looking at those two types that were on the market then, and I'm thinking, okay, one is soaked in Roundup, and Roundup, that weed killer, is what we're all told as parents not to put under our kitchen sinks because of the harm it might cause to kids. So I'm thinking, why did nobody tell me that this was being routinely sprayed on our food? And meanwhile, all the bees are dying. There's like all these signs. And then the second one, you know, with this genetically engineered corn that could produce its own insecticide. I can't read that. You're holding it under the chair. The second one that produces its own insecticide, you know, the industry at the time was telling us that it's substantially equivalent, which that it, you know, tastes and smells the same. It's more or less the same. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. That's what they were saying. But then I learned that the EPA regulates that corn as a pesticide because of the fact that it can cause harm to certain insects, and it might cause harm to ecosystems. So on the one hand, they're telling us, the FDA is saying, it's fine, it's safe. And as I looked at that, I thought, you know, how are they saying that this stuff is safe? Well, it turns out the FDA doesn't do any independent testing. And so Monsanto and these companies were the ones providing the study saying, guess what, our product's safe. And, you know, thankfully, my grandmother's still 102 years old, and I went straight to her, and she's crazy smart, and she's in the South. And she said, you know, this reminds me of the tobacco industry, where you had this kind of he said, she said science, where industry saying one thing, and the independent stuff is starting to prove it differently. So I thought, you know, if that's the case, that took 50 years, you know, of this back and forth he said, she said debate. So I'm probably going to be doing this for a long time before I start to talk about it, you know? And there was part of me that just really didn't want to talk about it. I mean, we've all seen, I love those, like, cigarette ads where the doctors are saying, it's the pause that refreshes. You know, I recommend it. And I think, you know, I saw that same thing happening with genetically modified food. And so I reached out to this scientist in Michigan who had been given this grant, and I said, you know, what's the deal? What are you studying for $447,000 or whatever the grant was for? And he said, you know, they're not going to knowingly insert a known allergen. I mean, that would just be insanity and totally stupid to knowingly insert an allergen. He said the concern is that as you insert that thing, a whole bunch of stuff is created. And, you know, a lot of people will refer to it as genetic rubble. And he said there's so much genetic rubble that it doesn't even have names. And they're not testing. And they're not waiting to test. They don't know how to test for that. And so, you know, he said that at this point in time, back in 2006, no animal testing model existed. So all of a sudden I'm thinking, like, we're the animal testing model. Like, we're that model. If they don't have that to do that pre-market testing before it gets into the food supply, we're the guinea pig. We're the model. So then I'm thinking... Let me just make one point there, which I find really interesting. So we were talking before that a lot of sort of conventional America says if you're anti-GMOs, you're anti-science. But science is fundamentally about testing and making sure it works. The GMO, you know, the people that are pro-GMO or anti-labeling, you know, they love to say that the science has been proven, but science doesn't stop. It doesn't stop. And I think, you know, one of the things that has been proven is that in the early days of the work, you know, 15, 20 years ago, when they were first introducing these products, and the forward-looking statements to shareholders, which that's That's my playing field.
Right.
I dug into their financial statements and their earnings reports and everything else. And in those forward-looking statements, they love to say, we can't anticipate, we can't be sure that this is actually going to do what we say it's going to do. But the PR spin was that use these products and it'll reduce the use of pesticides. And the USDA, over the years, as these products came on the market, reports have shown and scientific studies have shown that it has resulted in a 527 million pound increase in the application of pesticides. So, again.
And what's happened to allergies or obesity with children and
well,
US
again, the industry will say correlation is not causation. Me as an analyst, I'm going to say correlation is not causation.
Even without saying correlation.
Just because the overlay of food allergies, for example, from 1997 until 2007, the CDC reported a 265% increase.
Between when?
97 to 2007. Right. So right when these things were introduced, there was a 265% increase in the rate of hospitalizations related to food allergic reactions. So the industry will say, well, that's the same time that Dr. Oz took off. Or guess what? That's the same time that Oprah hit this great success. So maybe everybody's allergic to
and the Dr. Yankees got really hot.
Right. So you say correlation is not causation.
Sure.
And I agree with that, but a correlation of that magnitude, when you're talking about that level of concern and the fact that the EPA is funding these studies, that merits investigation, and at the very least, it merits labeling these ingredients, which is
same with cancer, same with obesity.
So, when these products were introduced in the mid-1990s, 60% of the world said, we don't have the long-term science on this. We don't know what the long-term impact is going to be. We don't know what they call the synergistic toxicity of, okay, here's the GMO that's now regulated as a pesticide by the EPA. Here's all the chemicals that get applied to it. What does all of that do in combination? Those synergistic toxicity studies hadn't been done either. And so that led countries around the world, our trading partners, China, Russia, India, countries that, I think the U.S. would maybe say we are way ahead of them on certain issues and certain human rights issues, and yet this human right to know what was in our food was something Americans hadn't been given, and that was hard to process. That in and of itself was a really hard thing to digest, because you think that we have these human rights that have been granted and protected, and that we really do lead in a lot of ways on that around the world. But to really learn that, not only countries in the UK or Europe or Japan or Asia or Australia, but Russia and India and China, they were labeling these ingredients and giving that fundamental human right to their citizens that we hadn't been given. To me, that became a much greater issue.
So for people who don't realize, I think, how is it that we don't know if there's GMOs in our food?
Because, back when the products were being introduced, the FDA basically had these subcommittee hearings. And, it was fascinating. I read through the transcripts of all of them. We had allergists that were basically saying, you're going to run an experiment on the entire population by introducing these things. I've met with some of those allergists. They were terrified. They were trying to call it out. And the FDA basically issued the statement that substantial equivalence exists, that it looks, tastes, smells the same. I think it's fascinating because the FDA doesn't have any kind of financial authority or budget to conduct its own independent testing. So again, they're relying on the industry producing the products for these safety studies, which right there is just a huge conflict of interest. So the industry will say there has been more science done on this than any other product ever in the food supply, and that's great if it's industry-funded science, but I don't really care about industry-funded science. I want to see the independent studies.
Sure.
And that's what the rest of the world said. They said, that's fine, that's industry-funded science, but we're going to label these things because the jury is still out, and we don't have that long-term human health study. We don't know what the long-term impact is. And it's fascinating because you look at a company like Monsanto, and in their SEC filings, they say, we can't label these things. We're not going to stand by our product and label them. We can't account for them every step of the way through the food chain, through the food supply. And that is crazy, because if a company like Intel said that, if Intel wasn't willing to stand behind their product, we wouldn't have that Intel Inside campaign. But Intel says, you know what? We believe in this product. We believe in the integrity of this product, and we're proud to stand behind it. We're proud to have our name on it every step of the way. into the computer, into the system, into the Best Buy store, into the box, into your home, you know it's got Intel inside.
So
we don't know if it's got GMO inside.
So without it, right. So without it being labeled, can we assume if it's conventional and it's like, what are the most GMO'd products?
Well, I mean, in the beginning when I was first realizing how pervasive these things were in processed food primarily, there were just kind of some key crops that were hitting. There was canola and canola oils in so much. Soy is in so much. Corn derivatives,
everything, corn syrup,
everything. I mean, you find it in bread, you find it in mustard, you find it in ketchup, and then sugar beets. And sugar can be used in a whole bunch of different things too. So all of a sudden, while the number of crops at that point in time was still fairly small, it was pretty pervasive in food. And one of the first steps we took as a family was we're gonna dial way back on this processed food. To reduce our exposure, not only to things like GMOs, but I was finding that for the health of these kids, I really wanted food that was free from these artificial ingredients. And I think to me, probably the most powerful motivator was when I learned that companies like Kraft and Coca-Cola, Walmart, Pepsi formulate their products differently for eaters in other countries. So if a single mom with 3 little kids who's on food stamps can only afford Kraft mac and cheese in the UK, for example, it's free from artificial growth hormones, artificial colors, and GMOs. So why isn't that same product on our grocery store shelves? That double standard, absolutely.
Because we don't have the right to know, so we don't know. Right?
And it's, it was more than that. I mean, it was just that the ability for these companies to influence lobbying and policy here in the United States, they couldn't do it the same way overseas. And so they had to adhere to that higher standard. And as I highlight in my book, I mean, it's at some point when they were pulling artificial colors out of all of their products overseas, I mean, they were so proud to boast that they were doing it in response to consumer demand to meet the needs of moms and dads and protect the health of children. Reading it, I'm like, we're not asking them to reinvent the wheel. I mean, they have already done this overseas. They've pulled artificial dyes, and the reason for the dyes was because of links to hyperactivity. They didn't use artificial growth hormones, and the reasons around that were that it was something that I had, and it just made my stomach turn, to learn that the United States was the only country in the world, only developed country in the world that had allowed for this artificial growth hormone, RBGH. And, again, as a business model, it made sense. You inject it into cows. It hypothetically helps them make more milk. But every one of our trading partners said when that gets pumped into the animals, it makes them sick. It causes mastitis. It causes clinical lameness, diseases on the skin, which result in this increased antibiotic and drug use. And so those countries said, we don't want all of that going into our food supply. And so they withheld. They kept it out. And, it was really, I think, learning about that double standard, that these U.S. companies were formulating their products differently with higher integrity and better ingredients overseas than they were here. Again, to me, it felt like a human rights issue. To me, I thought, it's one thing. We live in Boulder. We have access to clean food everywhere. I mean, it's kind of a joke how accessible it is. But I do a lot of speaking around the country, and I'm in front of audiences that don't even know. They don't even have access not only to the clean food, but they don't have access to the education about why it even matters. And if you look at healthcare costs in the United States versus other countries, we spend close to $9,000 a person on healthcare costs and disease management. Well, countries like the UK, where they've kept all these ingredients out or taken them out, that number's at like $3,500. So they're managing the health of their population in a very different way.
Sure. Yeah. In a responsible way. So what, we're about up on time. So what was sort of the evolution of how you raised your children, and how can we learn from that?
Well, I mean, I look back on it, and probably to this audience, I mean, they're so dialed in, but I just didn't have a clue. I'd been totally focused on finance and this other part of my life. And so, as I was starting to make the changes, I thought, okay, I can do one thing in my kitchen. I can get the artificial dyes out, or I can avoid these growth hormones, or I can avoid GMOs, to look for food that was free from these ingredients. And what I was quickly learning is that is actually what that USDA organic seal means, is that by law it's not allowed to be produced with dyes, growth hormones, toxic synthetic pesticides, GMOs. But that double standard felt like such an injustice to me. And when I was looking at the health of children, close family, nieces and nephews, friends who were losing children to pediatric cancer, learning that cancer is the leading cause of death by disease in kids under the age of 15, that 1 in 2 men and 1 in 3 women now are expected to get cancer. It was bigger than just my kitchen.
Sure.
And I knew with this analytical background that I could talk about it in a different way. And so as I began to reach out to people, I sort of had to build a team. And my first team that I built was really of scientists, because I have this finance background, not a science background. And then, it was realizing how accessible legislators were actually on the issue. That you get inside those offices, the congressmen or the senators, and it's just packed full of young 20-something-year-olds, who are super passionate about issues like this, and they want to be part of something that matters. And I think what surprised me was how easy it was to really start to build the movement. That food is so intimate for all of us. It's hugely intimate, and to be able to protect or help protect the health of somebody that you love, that is just one of the most important things you could do. And what I quickly saw was that there was suffering in every family. When you look at the rates of autism or allergies or cancer or diabetes, there's just not a family in the country anymore that isn't impacted by this. And because of that, we're all suddenly turning over those labels and reading them, and I say, like, when I'm in front of these big companies, I'll say, no mom in the country wants to be standing in that aisle reading the labels because she has a kid with a deathly peanut allergy or a kid with diabetes. She doesn't want to be there, but that's where she is, and if you can move with her and start to offer her products that are free from these ingredients, which we know they can do because they're doing it overseas, that's going to help us move through. So, I look at it as, right now, there's just an incredible opportunity, huge economic upside for these companies that start to move with the consumer. Companies like Chipotle, they're focusing on progress. They're not perfect, but they're focusing on progress. Kroger's doing the same thing.
Well, they're transparent, which is
Kroger's doing the same thing.
amazing.
They introduced a product line that was free from something like 200 ingredients, and it took off. It went from 0 to $1 billion in revenue in a 2-year period. So, there's huge demand for food that is free from a lot of this artificial stuff. And the companies that are responding to that first are just capturing this enormous economic upside.
So for the moms and all that out there, for the dads, for children, organic, less processed, what can we do in our, intimate relationship with our food?
I think with anybody with kids, cut the artificial dyes. Skittles, M&M, all those candies, they aren't made with artificial dyes overseas because of the link to hyperactivity.
Wow.
And anybody that has a little kid knows what it is to try to manage that hyperactivity. So you can do yourself a favor by just dialing back on those artificial colors. Then things like GMOs, really what we're finding is that it's become this little delivery vehicle for all these chemicals that are applied to it. So, if you want to dial back on that, we've got countries around the world now saying, not only do we not want GMOs in our food, but we don't want that weed killer Roundup either, because we're concerned about health concerns or what it might be doing to farms, and I think that's what we're starting to see, and farmers are starting to see it.
So dyes and GMOs and organic obviously is a good way to
organic can be such a loaded word because of the price point, and
But you can do bulk, or we have good articles on how to do it affordably. My mom did.
Right, you can do bulk. You can, I think don't be intimidated to try to grow something.
Right.
That was hugely intimidating to me. I thought,
Totally.
I'm good at math. I don't know if I'm gonna be good at this. And then one of the kids came home with a little lima bean in a cup, and I thought, okay, that is at its most fundamental, growing something. And if that's not intimidating, what if we did it in a pot that was a little bit bigger? And give yourself permission to kind of get a little messy with it, and start as small as you need to start, whatever you're starting with. And with us, we started pretty small. With our dyes was the first thing, and then we started to cut the other stuff. But
cool.
I think now we're seeing there's just this incredible movement that's starting, and there are all kinds of programs, farm to table programs in cities or school gardens that are starting to go in. I really make noise in whatever way you can. You know, the states, something like over 30 states now have introduced labeling initiatives to label GMOs. And some people will say, if they really are as bad as all this, shouldn't we just get rid of them altogether? You know, but I think you've really got to look at the process. And we begin by making noise around labeling. And so if Monsanto in their own SEC filing says, hey, we're not even going to label these things, why would anybody want to label them? I mean, why would anybody want to take on that liability? So I think what we'll start to see is what like a Chipotle is doing, or a Kroger, or a White Wave, where they dump those ingredients. They dump genetically engineered ingredients. They don't want to label them for the liability that it might carry. So they just dump them and go back to a non-GMO supply chain. And I think that's the trend that we're starting to see.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. Robyn O'Brien, thank you. And as always, you can find us on youtube.com/WaylonH. Lewis and SoundCloud. Thank you.